What's that? It was the geography. Okay, are we ready in the back? Good. Okay, I asked the sound guys to leave the microphones. She always gets me. I always think someone's talking to me every time. Every time. You get me every time. I asked the sound guys to leave the microphones out, so if anyone has any questions as we're going, you're not going to interrupt. You just raise your hand and we'll get to you if you have a question or comment on what we're going to look at. I want to make sure that you understand what it is I'm trying to say. It's going to be maybe a little bit complex, just a little bit, maybe a little bit difficult, a little bit, but I think we can get through it and then hopefully set us up good for next week. So we're going to be looking at over the next, I wanted to do this in 1 week and there's no way that's going to work out. So we're going to be over this week and 5 more weeks, we're going to be looking at Romans 10:9 and this tremendous statement of faith that Paul lays out in Romans. It is the heart of the gospel. If we're to take the gospel, which is the gospel is explained in many, many ways in the Bible. And that's good because, well, there are a lot of reasons, won't get into that, but it's a very complicated idea. The whole idea of salvation is very complicated, and we're trying to bring that out of the spiritual realm and trying to put it into words, and that's going to always be very difficult. But Paul, he summarizes it down to one phrase, and he says, this is the word of faith. This is the gospel, and this is the message of the gospel. And it's just this one phrase. It's right here in Romans chapter 10, verse 9. And just quickly, I'm going to give you a quick concept of Romans as a whole, very, very abstract overview. But Romans as a whole, the whole book looks to this phrase. It all goes to it, and all runs away from it. It is the center point, the key phrase, the key idea of Romans is Romans chapter 10, verse 9. It's all running to it. It's all running away from it, okay? So it's very important when you read Romans that you understand where you're at in that sense. And Romans chapter 10 is kind of tying up a lot of threads that he has started to weave all the way back from chapter 1. So in chapter 1, he has started out a whole bunch of these threads, and in chapter 10, he sort of grabs them and he's kind of like weaving them together, and he's weaving them all down to this one point that, as we will see. We're going to look a little bit at that, very little, because my point isn't trying to explain all of Romans, but I think it's important that we have an idea of what Romans is talking about. So that's kind of the book of Romans. Now, the actual context of Romans chapter 10, verse 9 starts in 9:30. That's where the context starts out in. And again, this is one of these places where you can't let the chapter divisions in the Bible stop your reading. You need to realize that these divisions aren't really meaningful for any type of understanding sense. You just have to overlook those. And this context starts in 9:30. If you read it, I think you'll see that it's very obvious that 10 is not how we normally think of chapters, right? When you read any other book, well, the author wrote the book in chapters almost always. And so the chapters are real hard divisions. But Romans wasn't written in chapters, and they were just applied there in basic blocks so that you can reference them. So you can't look at that and think, well, this is a new chapter. We're starting a new thought. We're not, all right? This isn't. In fact, Romans would only be maybe 2 or 3 chapters. If we were to divide it, right, the way it's structured, it would be very few chapters, which wouldn't be very helpful, right, to have 3 chapters. So that's why it's divided up like that. But the context starts in Romans chapter 9, verse 30. Now, we're not going to go over this because there's just no time, and I want to get through today so that we can start looking at the confession in verse 9. But I wrote it out, and I put it on Slack, and you can go and you can read that, which is, I wrote out an exegesis of these verses, chapter 9, verse 30, through 10, verse 13. So 15 verses or 16 verses, whatever that is, I wrote out an exegesis. So for those that don't know or didn't read it, an exegesis is kind of like a paraphrase whose purpose is to explain the structure of the writing. It's not a commentary. It's not supposed to be, right? It's not supposed to be a commentary. It's not supposed to explain to you what the doctrines are in it. It's only supposed to reveal or make clear, right, how the text is structured and what the meaning of the text is in itself. And it's a little hard for me to explain. I probably ought to work on explaining it better what it is. But I think if you'll go and read the one I wrote, you'll get an idea of what an exegesis is supposed to be. And the idea of an exegesis, and so this is where it's very important, I think, and why all of you should be interested in this. So the value of an exegesis is that it can be proven or disproven solely on if it reveals the structure of the text, right? It's not about do you agree with a doctrine or disagree. It's about saying, no, that isn't right because it doesn't explain this connection in the text. Or this part of the text doesn't fit there. That is, you're not properly elucidating the text. And so it makes it where it abstracts the text away from the idea of arguing over presupposed doctrines or prejudices of doctrine, and you're only analyzing what the text is saying. And that's a very important point to start at when we want to understand the Bible in context, is understanding what the context is saying. So you can go to Slack and find it. It's also, I put it on our website. So if you don't have Slack, you should get it. But if you don't have Slack, you can go to the website. If you click on the service at the top, the service link, then you'll see in there it says exegesis. You can click on that, and it'll give you the one I wrote. Now, there could be errors in that. Maybe you don't agree with how I divided it up and how I explained the different clauses. Then I would encourage you to email me and explain to me why, because I'd like to see that. I'm more than happy to have that conversation with anybody, because I don't pretend that it's perfect or even right, but it's how when I read it, it seems to me that that's what it's saying. So if you don't see it that way, well, I would love to get your input on that, and you can email me or on Slack, you can contact me. It can be private. You can do a direct message if you want, and say, look, I don't see this connection, or I don't see why you're doing it, and I'd be happy to try to explain that to you. But we don't really have time to go through that today, but I encourage you to read that. I think it'll help you understand a lot better than what I can explain to you in 30 or 40 minutes what this text is saying, okay? And I think that if you see how that type of study is done and try to do it yourself, I think it would help you tremendously in understanding the Bible. I think too often we want to understand the Bible by looking at one thing, one verse, one phrase, and we sit there and rack our brain to say, what could this possibly mean? And I think that's going about it the wrong way. I think we ought to be trying to understand just what the communication of the context is. What was the author saying before we try to figure out what he meant by it? So that's what an exegesis does. It's about what is he saying? How is he wording this? Why does he word it the way he words it? Is there some meaning to that? Why is it worded that way? So that's why that's important, and I think it would be very useful for you to do that. No, I won't lie to you. It's very hard. It's very hard. I worked on that one from 7 in the morning till like 12:30 at night, all day. So it's very, very hard. I hope I'm not discouraging you. Don't get discouraged. It's worth it. But whoever told you that understanding the scriptures was easy? This is something I think that we need to disabuse ourselves of. This notion that I should be able to read the Bible with my own prejudices and my own limited vocabulary and my own, and very nonchalantly, and whenever I have free time, by the way, and understand it perfectly. No, no, no. There is no promise anywhere in the scripture that it is going to be easy. In fact, all the opposite, right? It's understanding the scripture is likened like digging gold out of a mine. Now, maybe you don't realize how hard that is, but that's really hard to find gold and to get it out of a mine. There's a reason for that type of analogy, right? So it's very important. Christ said that anyone that could bring out understanding of the scriptures was a wise scribe, right? He excels. So this is not easy. So if you're thinking, well, I don't like your way, there's got to be like a shortcut, an easy way. There really isn't a shortcut. Now, I'm not saying it has to be my way. I'm just telling you, it doesn't matter what way you find. If it works, it was hard. It was hard. There's no easy way. Now, I think that doing an exegesis is a really good way to get some understanding to the text so you understand what it is you're even studying to begin with. And if any of you are interested in doing that and you're not sure even reading that one how to do it, I'd be more than happy to help you figure out how to do that and try to give you some tips. And we can even do some and maybe that'll help you. Anyways, okay, so let's look at this context. 9:30, we'll start there. We're going to look at that context as quickly as possible because next week I want to get and deal with Romans 10:9, but I think we ought to know what's going on in the context. So 9:30, Paul says, we'll start there. He says, what shall we say then? This is what we're going to say, he says. That the Gentiles, which followed not after righteousness, have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of faith. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. You see what he's saying? Now, this is all summarizing what he's been saying from chapter 1 and chapter 2. If you go back and read chapter 1 and chapter 2, he is now talking about that, right? He said all of what he said up to 9:30, and he says, okay, so how can we summarize what we've talked about up to now? And this is great about Romans. Romans does this a lot. He summarizes where he is up to that point, which makes Romans easier to understand. It's very helpful. So he says, okay, so we've talked about all of these things, and you can go back and read that. Romans 1, the Gentiles and their depravity. Romans 2, the Jews and their hypocrisy. All of that. He says, so what are we going to say about all this? What am I saying? Okay, here's what I'm saying. That the Gentiles, which weren't looking for righteousness, have attained righteousness. They've grasped it. They've gotten a hold of it. They've possessed it. They weren't looking for it, but they possessed it. And the Jews, or Israel, it's more important, Israel, which followed after it, in other words, were pursuing it all over the place. So you imagine the Gentiles not even knowing it exists practically, and the Jews are chasing around like a woman with a broom for a mouse, beating everything they can in sight, trying to find it, trying to have it. And he says, in Israel, which followed after it, has not attained it. It's this crazy thing, right? That you have one group of people who care for nothing in the entire world except the law of righteousness, who can't find it anywhere, and the other group of people who have no clue it even exists, and they find it. They not only find it, they possess it. That's what he says. That's what I'm saying. So if you thought that's what I was saying, then you're right. Ding, ding, right? You win the prize. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's exactly what I'm saying. Right. Okay. He says, now why would that be? He says, wherefore? That means, well, how could that possibly be? Why would we say such a thing? Why did they not attain it? He says, why did Israel not attain it? Why? Because they sought it not by faith. They were looking for it everywhere possible except one place. There was only one corner that they left unchecked, and that was where it was. How did they seek it? If it wasn't by faith, how were they trying to find it? They sought it by works of the law. Now that seems to make perfect sense. Because they're following off the law of righteousness, in other words, legal righteousness. They want to be legally righteous, and you would think if you want to be legally righteous, then you would certainly look for it in the law. It just intuitively makes sense. But see, it doesn't have to be intuitive. And we say, well, how do we know that intuitively they were wrong? Because they never had it, right? The proof of the pudding is in the eating. So, he says, they sought it not by faith, but as if they could have it by the works of the law. Now, why would they do such a thing? Why would a nation who is only interest, I mean the entire national pastime, was pursuing the law of righteousness? That was everything. That was their sport, that was their religion, that was their hobby, that was their business. Everything about their life was about that one thing. Why would they leave one corner unsearched? That corner of faith. Why would they do that? Why wouldn't they, if they cared so much about it, do that? It's kind of like Naaman, right? Naaman gets to Elisha, and he says, Elijah. I always get those two mixed up. Gets there to the prophet. I'll just say that. Gets there to the prophet, and he says, he wants to be healed, and the prophet says what? Go down and wash yourself 7 times. And Naaman leaves furious. Furious. Not going to do that. And his servants, it's always good to have smart servants working for you. Always hire smart people. Always. Right? I wouldn't know anything about that, but you always want to hire smart people to work for you. But they come up to him and say, hey, boss, if he would have asked you to do anything else, would you have done it? Of course. I would have conquered 100 cities. I would have climbed the highest mountain. All he's saying is wash yourself in the river. Don't you think you might want to give it a shot? And Naaman says, you got a point there, right? So you think about Israel. It's like everything that you read the Old Testament, everything they're willing to do to attain to the law of righteousness, and they can't get it. And the one thing that where it's at, this thing, it seems like, why wouldn't you just give it a shot? There's a reason why. He says why. Because they stumbled at the stumbling stone. There was something there that offended them. And then he quotes this verse. Now, this is actually a quote from 2 different passages. The quote is incredibly interesting. We have a little bit of time to get into it, so I'll kind of show you how it's interesting. But he quotes from these 2 different passages. The first one is from Isaiah 8:14. It is, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense. And then the second one is Isaiah 28:16. And he says, and whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. And those are disconnected. They're not put together. But Paul puts them together. Why does Paul put them together? Because Jesus put them together. Right? This is where we see Paul building off of the teachings of Jesus. Jesus put those together. Jesus, in Matthew 21, he talks in the same similar language about this cornerstone upon which if you fall, you'll be broken, but if it falls on you, you'll be completely crushed to dust. And Christ is putting another quote into there, which is Daniel. Right? Because Daniel talks about this mountain upon which a rock is carved out of it, not by a human hand. There's God carves out a rock out of a mountain, and the rock comes down, and whatever it falls on, it just pulverizes it. And Jesus is saying, I'm the rock. I am the piece of divinity, if you will, carved out of the Godhead, come down to earth. Now you're going to trip over me, or I'm going to crush you. But nobody's going to get away unscathed. You will either trip over Christ and you'll be broken on him, or he will fall on you and completely pulverize you. It's one or the other. Well, this was very difficult. The Jews, Israel, I should say, I keep saying that, Israel as a nation could not accept this. They stumbled over Christ. But here's the problem. Christ is the only legitimate object of faith. You think, today we use the word faith very broadly and very loosely. We talk about their faith and our faith and people of faith and all these different faiths, and we're really talking about religion or belief systems, right? Right? In the Bible, and look, this is not wrong to use it that way. Words are wonderful things and can be used many ways. But we do need to understand how the Scripture is using the word also. And we're not talking here about faith in that sense. There is only one way to have faith as the Bible employs that word, and that is faith in Christ. Anything that is not faith in Christ is not faith at all. Is not faith at all. So why is it that they would not approach righteousness through faith? Because you can't have faith except in Christ, and Christ was a stumbling block. And so they rejected that. And that's what Christ said. He said in his way of talking about this, he said that the rock that the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. And that cornerstone became a stumbling block to Israel. And then they were to be pulverized by it, which is, a terrible, horrible prophecy. But there is also a promise in that prophecy, and that is that whosoever believes in that stumbling stone, in that rock, in that stone that's cut from the mountain without hands, whoever believes in it will be saved. Now this is will not be ashamed, is how the prophecy goes. Whosoever believeth on him, on the rock, shall not be ashamed. Now that forms the basis for what he's about to go on before them. That then becomes the basis for the following verses. So it's important to notice how he's working that in to the next one. But first he wants to give you a small caveat, because it's important here. He says, now, and this is kind of stepping out of the discussion for a moment, and he wants to deal with Israel again. So he says, brethren, this is chapter 10, verse 1. He says, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. So Paul isn't saying any of this to condemn them. His desire isn't to say they deserve it, the stone's going to crush them, they're going to be turned to dust. That's not what Paul wants. He's saying all of this so they might be saved. Why? Why does he want them to be saved particularly? Beside the point that he's a Jew as well, he says that's also why. They're my brethren in the flesh. He talks about that later on. But here he has another reason why. He says, because I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. Meaning they're passionate about God. They're like what we just described, right? They're searching for righteousness everywhere. What's not to like about that? These are the kind of people you want to be your neighbors. These are the kind of people you want to do business with. These are the kind of people you want to take their values and build your entire civilization on. What's not to like about this? It's so painful to see upright people be condemned. If you see people who are wicked and evil and they have a degenerate culture and you think, well, they're going to be condemned, that isn't even difficult. It's hard not to applaud that. But when you see people like who he's describing the Jews to be, having a constant day and night, 24-hour, 24/7 passion for God, he says, we want them to be saved. Absolutely want them to be saved because they have a tremendous zeal for God. But it's not according to knowledge. Now, this is an important connection. This sentence, this phrase is a very important connection to what he's explained in chapter 2. Okay, so in chapter 2, verses 17 through 20, he talks to the Jews directly. Right? He talks to Israel directly. He says, you rest in the law. You trust that you're an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of the babes. You have a form of knowledge and truth in the law. Right? He goes through, and when you read what he describes, it looks like what he's saying in chapter 2 is that they are knowledgeable. But now in chapter 10, in chapter 10 he's saying they're not knowledgeable. And the key to this is that what they had and what he describes that they have in chapter 2 is not real knowledge. It's a form of knowledge. It's the shape of knowledge. But there's nothing in it. So imagine a mannequin, right? A clay mannequin has every appearance of being a person. It's molded, it's cast maybe even with the actual form of a person, actually a real person, and they cover them with latex and then they cast it that full of clay and they turn it in, it looks exactly like, but there's no life in it, there's no reality in it, there's no substance in it. That's what Paul is telling them. Yes, you have the form of knowledge we talked about in chapter 2, but you don't have any of the reality of it. It just looks like it. So it's a shell. Now this isn't. This goes beyond just their own personal instantiation of this issue. This also is a good way for you to understand what the Old Testament is. And one day we need to talk about this more in detail, but just to give you like a primer on this. So you have the idea of the Old Testament and the New Testament, and one way of thinking about this is that the New Testament is just Old Testament 2.0, right? It's like a new version of the old one. Or it's a new one, but it's the same thing. So basically it'd be like two 2x4s laying on the ground, one against the other, right? Stacked against, touching each other. It's like the new one, boom, and it's like it just filled in the bridge. The Old Testament was half the bridge, and the New Testament's the other half of the bridge. No, that's not at all right. That's the wrong analogy. So I want to give you an analogy that might be a little closer to how you ought to think about what the Old and the New Testaments are. The Old Testament is like, imagine a gurney. And over the gurney is a big sheet covering it, and you're looking at it, and pushing up the sheet, it looks like the form of a human body. Now, if you're in a hospital and you see that, you're going to think, there's a person underneath this sheet. But you grab the sheet and you lift it up, and what you find underneath is a mannequin. That's the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the mannequin pushing up the form of what looks like the New Testament. That's the Old Testament. And the New Testament is the sheet. That's the New Testament. The New Testament runs across the entire Old Testament and everything we call the New this time, and it runs all the way back into eternity because the New Testament is grace. It's infinite. It didn't start at the cross. It always has been. Everyone saved in the quote-unquote Old Testament was saved by grace, not by law. That's very clear in the Scriptures. Everyone saved in the future will be saved by grace. Anywhere, at any time. If anybody is saved, it's always by grace. It just runs across. So that's the sheet. The New Testament is. Now, if we want any reality to the shape that the New Testament has, then we got to get rid of the mannequin and we got to put in a real body. Which, interestingly enough, God says in Hebrews that he prepared himself a body. And he pushed out the old symbols, all those things that were holding a shape in place, and they were necessary and important in their time because they held that shape and you could see the shape and understand what was coming. But the problem is that Israel fell in love with the mannequin. And when the real body came, Christ, to fill in that space and occupy that void and give it not only the form, the shape that we think of, but the substance of it, so that there was an actual real substance under that shape, they couldn't accept that. They stumbled at that because he was displacing all the symbols. He was coming and he took a bat to the mannequin. Destroyed all these symbols. And he thought, you're destroying the Testament. He says, I'm not destroying the Testament. I'm taking out the symbols and I'm filling them with substance. Well, like I said, we really don't have time to go into that. We're just going to have to stop there. But you can think about that for a while. Gives you something to consider. Yes, you got to get a microphone or nobody can hear you in the video. The one person watching who is you won't be able to hear yourself. The other red.
You got it? Yeah. So who structured that mannequin? Would it be God himself,
yes,
through Moses giving the laws and ordinances to
yes,
Israel?
That's right. God put in place a stand-in, a temporary thing. So he wants to have this shape so everyone can see it, to know what's coming. So he builds all these symbols that all of them together are meant to represent Christ, right? So It's not that one thing in the Old Testament represents Christ. The whole thing does. The sacrifices, the washings, the vessels, the temple, everything is because there is not one of them that can accurately and completely make the shape of Christ. It's just not possible. So you have all of these things that all together, if you were to stand back and look and cover them up with this sheet of grace, it would look like Christ. But it isn't Christ. So when Christ comes, he pushes all that out and he fills in that space. Got it? Okay. So yes, the question is yes. God made all of those symbols, and the Jews, or Israel, got very confused and thought what we need to be holding on to are all these symbols, not understanding that the symbols were never meant to stay. They're just placeholders. Right? It's like someone who makes a shoe. I lived in Mexico, in León, and they make shoes there, and they all have these little wooden blocks that are shaped like a foot, and they stick that in there, and they stitch up the shoes, and they wet them, and they mold them, and they get them. But you never intend for the little wooden thing to stay there. When you buy shoes, it comes with a little cardboard one, right? You don't leave that in there, not unless you're, weird. No, you take that out. What do you do with that? You throw that away. Because what you're interested in is putting a real foot inside of a shoe. Right? And you certainly don't take out the little cardboard thing and throw away the shoe, unless you're really weird. All right. So that's what he's saying here. Yes, they did have the form of knowledge. I know I said that, but they didn't have actual knowledge. Right? And that's what he's saying in chapter 10. He says they did not have, they had a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. And he explains this. So here's how he's going to explain. You say, well, how is this possible? How could they not have that? Well, he explains it. He says, because they were ignorant of God's righteousness. Which one is that? Well, that's the righteousness that's through faith. Right? The one that can actually be attained. They're looking for the law of righteousness, a principle of righteousness. They should have been looking for the righteousness that comes from God, but they were ignorant of that. They didn't know what that. And what did they do? And since they had this ignorance, he says they went about trying to establish their own righteousness. And when they did that, they were refusing to submit unto the righteousness of God. So what we have here is we have an ignorance, we have a bad intent, and we have a rebellion. This is three things he gives you, three explanations to what he said that are kind of like stair-stepping conclusions, right? He says the first thing is that they're ignorant of the righteousness of God. They have an intent to have their own self-righteousness, because they're rebellious and will not submit to the righteousness of God. How do they not submit to the righteousness? They would say, that's absurd. All our life we've submitted to the righteousness of God. Every commandment, every rule, every symbol, we have done nothing but submit. No, because the righteousness of God, the only righteousness of God, comes through Christ. Oh, we don't want him. Exactly. You've stumbled at the stumbling stone. And doing so is not submitting to the righteousness of God. Yes.
So,
Red?
So should they have, you said they were ignorant. Should they have known? Could they have known?
Yes.
You said they couldn't have known. You said something like that.
Of course they could have known. Christ went back, like Brother Trinidad explained today, he went back and showed many people through the Old Testament how it spoke of Christ. And there are plenty of prophecies. Paul makes this entire case quoting the Old Testament prophecies. I'm going to send a stumbling stone, a rock of offense. I'm going to carve a rock out of a mountain. It's going to be very hard to accept. But whosoever believes on him, shall not be ashamed. They absolutely should have known. And then Christ came, sent John the Baptist first to announce it. Then he shows up and tells them. And this is what you have to understand what Paul's saying. He starts off saying, well, they're ignorant of. You think, okay, well, how could they possibly know? But then he says, no, but they have rebelled against the righteousness of God and instead said, we'll establish our own righteousness instead. So if we can't have God's righteousness, we can't find it, and we're not willing to accept Christ, then what we're going to do is we're going to be self-righteous. There's no excuse for this whatsoever. Right? This is not the idea of pity them. Not in that way, no. So, their pursuit of the law then becomes a rebellion to true righteousness. Because what they've now said is, we're no longer looking for God's righteousness through the law, we're looking to become self-righteous by the law. Initially, that wasn't the case. They looked at it and they're trying to pursue God's righteousness through the law. And there's a legitimate, he's going to explain that for a moment. That was a perfectly legitimate pursuit. But once Christ came, and they looked at that and said, no, we refuse him, like parables talk about, where the son comes to the vineyard and they say it's the son, it's the heir, let's kill him. The moment they've done this, they've rejected God's righteousness altogether because they don't like the conduit by which it's going to come. They don't want that. They're like, you know what? If that's what it takes to have God's righteousness, then we'll just set up our own. All right. And so this is where, we can go back to Romans 2. 20 says, therefore, thou which teachest another, teachest not thou thyself. Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of God, through breaking the law, dishonorest thou God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. You think, so what does that mean? Does that mean that when God, that they would say to people, don't kill, and then they were killing people? That's not what it means, right? It's what it means in a way. Yes, but not that obviously, right? This goes back to Christ's teaching, where he says, you've heard it said of old, thou shalt not kill. If you hate your brother, you're guilty of the same sin, right? And we know that because in the first ones, it seems like he's just saying, you say not to commit adultery, but you're over there committing adultery. It seems like that. But then he lets you in on what he's really saying, because he says, you abhor idols, but you commit sacrilege. You know what sacrilege is? Sacrilege is taking things that are sacred and using them for your own purposes. The new translations will put in there, and it's a kind of a kiddie version of that, is robbing temples, right? Robbing temples. So when you go into a church and you rob the offerings, that's sacrilege. But what is the essence of that sin isn't the robbing of a temple, because that's thievery. The essence of the sin is taking things that are sacred, that are for God, that are God's things, and using them for your own purposes. This would be like if you worked for, say you were an employee of a church, and they gave you a vehicle to use for church use, and you went and used it to go to the movies. That would be sacrilege. And that's idolatry. So what we see here is what he's saying is, you Israelites say, we're not killing, we're not committing adultery, we're not idolaters, and he's just echoing what Christ taught in Matthew 5. Yes, you are, but on a different level. It's the same sins, they just don't have the same form. Again, going back to what he says, they have the form of this knowledge, but not the substance of it. So they have the form of the law, and they've just found loopholes where they can commit the same essence of sin. You have something, Mike? Green. Green. All right, give him one here. There's a...
So I was just going to point out that this thing is still around today. For instance, I was talking to someone just a little while ago who said, I refuse to believe that God would take some little old grandmother who's never really done anything wrong ever in her whole life, but she doesn't believe in Jesus, and she dies and she would go to hell, but you take some murderer who's lived his whole life wicked, and then he repents at the end of his life, and he believes in Jesus, and God would take him to heaven. I refuse to believe that. And that's exactly what the problem was with Israel, and he shows that thing in the story of the prodigal son, and this issue and this is the story he's telling here in this little passage in the end of Romans chapter 9, the beginning of chapter 10. This was the problem that Israel had with faith, was that the Gentiles, who hadn't been doing all that stringent stuff that they had, would just be able to receive this righteousness by faith and didn't have to be circumcised, didn't have to pay a fee, didn't have to go through this process, didn't have to keep the law all those years. They weren't even looking for righteousness, but they get it by faith in this relatively late period after all that Israel went through. This is why they stumbled at it. They had that exact same problem.
Why. That's exactly right. It's a big. In fact, one thing I didn't mention, but the let's call it the, how would I put it? The symbolic structure of Romans is the prodigal son. You can take the parable of the prodigal son and lay Romans on it, and it maps right to that. Same mapping. It's very interesting. You should look at that. You can just look at the prodigal son. When you understand it, I wrote a little article on it. You can read that on the website, kind of get an idea of what, oh, it's not out yet, is it? It's coming out on Wednesday. On Wednesday, it drops. That's how they like to say it. It drops on Wednesday. And you can read it, and it explains the parable of the prodigal son, what it's talking about, what the point is, kind of goes through it. And then you can map Romans onto that, and that is the symbolic structure of how Romans is set out, okay? Just like Micah said. Also, closely connected to that is the parable of the vineyard and the laborers, right? Who want some work all day and then some work an hour, and the ones who work all day are mad because the one that worked only an hour, like Mike was talking about, right? They get paid the same. It was a stumbling stone. So all of this thing is where Christ is revealing what the offense is to this and why Christ was offensive, because he was the one instituting all these offensive things. Okay, there's a lot more we could say about that. Let's move along. Very real quickly on this, the quote where Paul says, for the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, that is found in Isaiah 52. Isaiah 52. Reason that's significant is Isaiah 52 and Isaiah 53 are the same context. There's no actual reason for that. It's another one of these chapter divisions that's not meaningful. It just, you can read it, runs right on through. We all know what Isaiah chapter 53 is. That means that he's putting that all in the context of the Messiah. And that's important as you look at what he's talking about, Romans and all of that. It's whenever you look, we looked at this a few weeks back on Old Testament quotes, remember? What we looked at, how these Old Testament quotes, you can't just read that one phrase and think that's the whole point of them. You have to go look, and when you look at the context of the Old Testament quote, you'll realize they intend for you to look at the entire context. It all comes into what he's saying. So when you go and look at Isaiah 52 and 53, and you put that entire context of the Messiah and all of that stuff, then you understand what he's saying a little better when he says the name of God is blasphemed among you Gentiles. All right. So what does he mean here by this? Let's just very quickly say this is all in the tradition of Christ, where Christ, for instance, talks about how they wear these long robes, right? They wear these long robes, and to be admired of men. They pray in public. What are they doing? They're committing sacrilege. They're taking the things of God, prayer, fasting, right? And they're using them for their own gain. Okay, so let's keep going here. Get a microphone. You gotta get a microphone. Get you one over here. Or say it. If it's one thing, say it, and I'll repeat it. No, it can be anything. It can be anything. God's honor that's meant to be given to God. The Pharisees, so his question was, is it not just financial? No, if sacrilege is the what do you call it? concrete example would be money or meat, things that are concrete, but it's everything. It's them going, and Christ says you're committing sin because when you fast, you go and you do it in public, and you put ashes on you, and you look like you're all starving, so everyone, why? So people will see you, and you will receive honor. That's sacrilege. That's supposed to be a sacrifice to God, and you're making it a sacrifice to your own ego. Okay, so there you can see how Paul is working in all of this stuff. So now let's get back to our text. He says they've ignorant of God, they don't submit to the righteousness of God, and instead of doing that, they want to build up a facade of their own self-righteousness. But now what does he say next? So here's the deal. He says, for Christ, and this is extremely important, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believes. Why would they do that? Because remember, we stepped out and we started talking about his desire for the Israel. Now he's going back to where he was, where he started. They stumbled at Christ. Why would they reject the righteousness of God, try to establish their own righteousness? Because Christ is the end of the law. Why do they not like Christ? Because Christ is the end of the law. Now, he's the end of the law for righteousness, but he's the end of the law. That's very hard to accept. It goes back to what we're saying. Christ comes and says, all these things on the table that you've been so focused on, you shouldn't have been. You should have been looking at the form that they make, the silhouette that they paint. And you would notice, that's me. Look at the silhouette on the wall. When the light of grace shines over the symbols of the Old Testament, it casts a shadow on the wall, and that shadow is Christ. And here I am. Look at me. Now get all those things off and put me there instead. Nope. Absolutely not. Why not? Because of that. Because Christ is the end of the law. Now, it's important, we need to take a moment and just talk about this phrase, because you need to be aware of what this phrase could mean. So when he says it's the end of the law, there's a lot of ways that what end can be, right? And it's not immediately apparent or obvious that end means what we want it to mean, perhaps. So, and this is true in English, it's true in Spanish, it's true in Greek, it's true in every language I've looked at. End is an incredibly robust word. It has many meanings. And I could give you like 15 of them, legitimate meanings for end, right? I'll just give you a few. It can mean conclusion or summary. It can mean termination or undoing. It can mean fulfillment or culmination. It can mean goal, aim, purpose, objection, a raison d'etre. It can mean result or consequence. It can mean limit or boundary. And all of those things are different. Some are very different. So let's just take it down to its most simple extremes. Culmination and termination. Let me explain what the difference of those are. I'll give you a few what ifs or a few examples of what it could be. So Christ is the end of the law can mean, it could be in the sense of that the ninth inning is the end of the game. Or it can mean a thunderstorm is the end of the game. You see the difference between those? Let me give you another one. Maybe that one's not as clear as for you yet. So it can mean in the sense that seeing is the end of sight, the purpose of it. Or it can mean in the sense that blindness is the end of sight. Okay, here's another one. It could be like in the sense that marriage is the end of love. Or it could mean marriage is the end of love. Oh, you got that one. I knew you would get that one. See? It clicked. I knew it. I knew I could get through. Here's one. It can mean in the sense that wages, Marco didn't get it. Marco's like, what? Oh. But which one? You don't know. Well, which one is she happy about? That way of phrasing it, I worked on that a long time. Make it really ambiguous. No one can know which is which, but you all know. You all know. That should tell you something. I got one that I'll tell Kelly later. It'll be very funny. Okay. Okay. It can mean that Christ is the end of the law in the sense that wages are the end of work, or in the sense that the Sabbath is the end of work. See the difference on what the end is? So Christ could be the end of the law in the sense that he's the culmination of it. He's like the tip of the spear. He's the last piece of the puzzle. Right? That's the end of it. He's the result of it, the culmination of it, the completion, the greatest, the climax of it, the whatever you want to call it. He's there's a problem with that. That means he's part of it. It doesn't matter how big a piece you assign to him. You cannot call Christ a piece of anything. That's a serious doctrinal, theological problem. I understand the desire to look at that and go, what it is that Christ is the final, last, great, glorious piece that filled in the whole puzzle. Well, that all sounds wonderful, except, right, you're calling him a piece of the puzzle, and that's difficult. That's challenging there. What's that? Of course it does. That's exactly right. Yeah. And then we have to say, well, then he's not a necessary piece either. Because for Israel, their puzzle was never finished. They still pursued the righteousness of the law. And so he's not a necessary piece. It's problematic. So I think that what he's saying is very clear, that Christ is the termination of the law. It's like a thunderstorm puts an end to the game. It's not part of the game. Right? The ninth inning also puts an end to the game. It's the expected inning. It's part of the game for the game to end then. But when a thunderstorm comes up and rains off the field, the game is over also. But the thunderstorm is not a player. It's an act of God. Okay, now we got it. Okay. Now, does the text make this clear? I think it does. Because Paul says, and he explains this, for Moses describes the righteousness which is of the law. So Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. If he's part of the law, then he would be part of the righteousness that Moses describes. Right? I mean, that's just the logical thing. He says no, but Moses describes the righteousness which is of the law. The righteousness that could come by the law has nothing to do with Christ. So Christ cannot be the culmination of the law for righteousness. He has to be something else. What is the righteousness which Moses describes? That the man that doeth these things shall live by them. No part of Christ, live by them. We are way out of time. Let's try to wrap this up. Real quick, very interesting. That's Leviticus 18:5. It's the most quoted verse in the whole Bible. Leviticus 18:5, meaning in the Bible, Bible writers quote that phrase more than any other verse. They quote it 6 times. The man that doeth these things shall live by them, but that excludes Christ. So Christ is not the culmination of the law for righteousness. He is the termination of the law for righteousness. Has to be. It's the only way that fits. It's the only way that explanation, which it is, because it says for, right? It's an explanation. It's the only way it fits. So here he says this. Well, let's summarize real quick. Christ, what we found to this far is that Christ precludes the law. Because the righteousness that he offers, and we don't have a lot of time for this, but it's less expensive, it's more readily available, and it's more secure. Now, I realize you're going to look and say, well, that doesn't make sense because it's very expensive, but not for you, right? Not for the consumer. The righteousness that the law prescribes is very expensive for you. The righteousness of Christ. So if you have just from a market mentality, an economic mentality, you have the righteousness of the law, which is do everything forever and live, and the righteousness of Christ, which is believe and live, who's going to go to the one of the law? So even if Christ's intention is not to exclude the law, the fact that he sets up an alternative source of righteousness, which is less expensive, more readily available, and more secure by fiat, right, terminates the other. It's like if you were selling cars for $1 million a piece, and then I started selling cars for $1 a piece. I don't have to go and burn your business down. The fact that I provide that option that is less expensive precludes yours. And this is what Christ did with the law. He says, I do not here to forcefully or violently terminate the law. But that is the end result. Okay. But righteous, that's how the law speaks, but this is how righteousness speaks. The righteousness which is of faith speaketh on this wise. Now, first thing he says is what it doesn't say. It does not say, in thine heart, who shall ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down from above, or who shall descend into the deep? That is to bring Christ up again from the dead. You can read, I wrote a thing on that, read it, we won't get into that. But what does it say? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. So he says, what is the word of faith? It's right here on the tip of your tongue. You know it. You know what that word of righteousness is. What is it? That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. That's the word of righteousness. And we got to stop there. I'm sorry, we are over time. So next week, we'll start looking at that word of faith, all right?